When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, not from fear of being caught, but from the certainty that he'd find those messages. The ones I forgot to delete. I lunged to grab the phone from his hand, but he pulled it back swiftly, his eyes still glued to the screen. I watched his face shift, expression by expression, line by line, and felt my world start to crumble beneath me. Yes, he was about to learn the truth. But not the whole truth. His hands trembled as he scrolled further, and I knew he was closing in on that message. The one that would end everything. Or maybe twist it into something even more unbearable. Then, right there in his hand, my phone buzzed. A new notification. I watched the color drain from his face as he read the sender's name. He froze. Didn't blink. My mouth went dry. I bit the inside of my cheek, an old habit whenever panic took hold. I heard his breath quicken, even from across the room. That was the moment I'd dreaded the most. Because 3 months ago, I made a choice. One that unraveled everything. One that changed me. One I thought I'd buried. But now, I realize I owe you the truth. Before I share the secret I've kept buried for far too long, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and have you ever hidden something you thought would never come to light, only for it to explode in your face anyway? The sound of the screen door creaking open didn't even pull me from my thoughts anymore. He was home, again, for barely a day. His suitcase always landed with a soft thud in the hallway, and I never needed to look up to know that it was him. My husband. The man I built a life with. The man who kissed my forehead each time he left, who never yelled, never forgot our anniversary, who paid the bills, who was safe. Steady. Predictable. I loved him once like you love the sunrise, warm, reliable, beautiful in its own way. But even sunrises lose their magic when they become routine. That afternoon, I was sitting in the kitchen with a lukewarm cup of coffee I never bothered to finish, scrolling aimlessly on my tablet. He came in, kissed the top of my head, asked about dinner, and I smiled like I always did. I lied like I always did. Pasta, I said. Your favorite. He didn't notice the pause. He never did anymore. Later, I watched him from the hallway as he unpacked. Socks folded into neat pairs, shirts hung immediately. His movements were mechanical. I used to find comfort in his orderliness, but now it just reminded me how little space there was in our lives for anything unexpected. For passion. For me. It was 2 days later, after he'd left again, that I heard the knock at the door. At first, I didn't answer. I wasn't expecting anyone. I thought maybe it was the neighbor again, asking if I'd seen her cat. But the knock came again, firmer this time. I opened the door, and there he was. My father-in-law. He stood there holding a set of old wooden planks and a toolbox, a cigarette tucked behind his ear. Thought I'd stop by and help with that porch, he said, without waiting for an answer. He just walked past me, like he'd always belonged there. I should have felt annoyed, maybe even invaded, but I didn't. I felt relief. Or something like it. We hadn't spoken properly in years. Only the polite kind of conversations you have at family barbecues or holidays. How's work? How's the garden? How's the arthritis? But that day, when he set the wood down and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, something shifted. I noticed his hands, rough and sun-spotted. I noticed the way his sleeves were rolled up, and the small scar near his elbow. I noticed his presence. We didn't talk much that afternoon. Just worked side by side. But it was the silence that lingered afterward. It followed me back into the house, wrapped around my chest like a question I didn't know how to answer. The next morning, he came back. Didn't finish the railing, he said. He looked like he hadn't slept much. Or maybe I was projecting. I invited him in for coffee. He accepted. We sat across from each other in the same kitchen where I spent most mornings alone. And we talked. Really talked. About my husband, about his son. About how distant he'd become, how tired he always seemed, how much time he spent away. He listened. Not just with polite nods and empty affirmations, but really listened. I saw it in his eyes, the way he leaned in, the way he didn't look away when I stumbled through my sentences or admitted things I hadn't even said aloud before. I told him how lonely I felt, how invisible. I don't know why I said it. Maybe I was waiting for someone to ask. He didn't say much back. Just sat with it. With me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, counting the ceiling fan rotations. I imagined what it would feel like to be touched, not just out of habit or obligation, but out of hunger. Desire. I hadn't felt desired in so long. I wasn't sure I'd recognize it if it stood right in front of me. 2 days later, he came again. This time, he brought paint for the porch. He made a joke about how the house deserved more than just splinters and creaks. I laughed. It was a real laugh. The kind that catches you off guard and makes your eyes water. We painted in silence, save for the occasional brushstroke against wood. At one point, he reached past me to grab the roller, and his arm brushed mine. It was nothing. But it wasn't. That night, I stood in the mirror and looked at myself. Really looked. Not to check my makeup or cover gray hairs, but to see myself. My reflection felt foreign. Older, yes. Softer in places. Harder in others. There were lines I didn't remember forming. But there was also something else. Something alive behind my eyes. I touched the side of my neck, traced the curve of my collarbone, and I remembered what it felt like to be a woman, not just a wife. I didn't plan what happened next. It wasn't a scheme. It wasn't even a thought. It was just a moment. But you know what they say, sometimes a moment is all it takes. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was silent, but my mind was loud. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, not moving, not thinking, just letting the morning light stretch across the floor like a slow wave. I hadn't seen him since we painted the porch. There was nothing particularly dramatic about that afternoon, and yet it haunted me. Every gesture, every pause in conversation, every brush of his sleeve near mine. It wasn't what he said, it was what he didn't say. What neither of us said. But it lingered in the air between us, as thick and undeniable as humidity before a storm. I made coffee I didn't want and stood by the window, staring out at the yard. The railing looked different now. Brighter. More cared for. I realized it wasn't the porch that had changed, it was me. And not in some poetic, sweeping way. It was quieter than that. Like a slight shift in gravity you don't notice until something falls. Mid-morning, I heard a car door. I peeked through the blinds. It was him again. He was wearing the same denim jacket, sleeves still rolled, toolbox in hand. My stomach tightened in a way I didn't fully understand. I walked to the door slowly, as if taking time would dilute the weight of the moment. It didn't. He didn't wait for an invitation this time either. Just a nod and a quiet, thought we could finish up the steps today. I opened the door wider, letting him pass. As he moved by me, I caught a faint scent of sawdust and old cologne, something oddly comforting. I followed him to the porch without saying anything. We worked like we had before, in silence, rhythmically, with unspoken coordination. At one point, I handed him a drill and our fingers touched. Briefly. Lightly. But it was enough. We both paused, the tool between us, eyes locked for a second too long. I looked away first. He cleared his throat and went back to his task. The day stretched lazily. We worked slower than needed. Maybe neither of us wanted to leave that space, that bubble. I asked him if he wanted lunch. He hesitated, then nodded. We sat in the kitchen again, like before, eating sandwiches that didn't matter. He asked me about my hobbies, and I laughed, genuinely, because I couldn't remember the last time someone asked me that. After lunch, he lingered in the doorway. He looked tired, but in a thoughtful kind of way. He said, I should go. But he didn't move. And I didn't ask him to stay. That evening, I stood in front of the mirror again. Not to analyze or criticize, but just to look. My hair had more gray than I remembered. The lines around my mouth were deeper. But my eyes, they looked different. There was something alive in them again. Not joy. Not regret. Just something real. I spent the next few days busying myself with anything that could fill time. Organizing drawers, deep cleaning the stove, refolding laundry that was already folded. Anything to avoid sitting still. Stillness meant thinking. And thinking meant remembering. I hadn't told anyone. Not a single soul. I didn't know what I would even say. There was nothing technically wrong. Nothing had happened. Except it had. On the fourth day, the phone rang. Not a message. Not an email. A call. It was him. I let it ring twice before answering. He asked if he'd left his wrench set behind. I said I hadn't seen it. He said he'd stop by anyway, just to check. I said okay. And then neither of us hung up for a long moment. When he arrived, it was already dusk. The sky was that soft blue-gray before darkness, when everything feels quieter than usual. He didn't ask to come in this time. He just stood at the door, looking at me. I stepped aside. He walked into the kitchen without a word. We didn't talk about the wrench. Instead, we talked about nothing. About the weather, about a neighbor's dog, about old music. But underneath it all was something else. A current neither of us dared name. It happened when I reached for the kettle and he reached at the same time. Our hands collided. We paused. And then we kissed. Nothing else. Just that. But it was enough to knock the air from my lungs. It wasn't planned. It wasn't slow. It wasn't wild either. It just was. When we pulled away, we didn't say anything. He looked at me like he was searching for the right words, but didn't find them. I stepped back. He nodded. And then he left. I closed the door behind him and leaned against it, hand over my chest. My heart wasn't racing. It was steady. Too steady. Like it already knew what came next. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling again, but the fan didn't spin this time. The silence wasn't comforting. It pressed against me like a weight. The kiss hadn't been a mistake, but it had changed everything. Because it confirmed what I'd tried to deny, that I wanted more than what I had. Not just more attention. More truth. More connection. More of myself. I knew things couldn't continue as they were. Something had started, and I had no idea where it would end. But I also knew something else. Whatever happened next, I wouldn't be able to undo this. And somewhere deep inside, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The morning after the kiss unfolded like any other. I made coffee. Washed the same mug I always used. Opened the curtains in the living room, letting in the hesitant autumn sun. But something was different. Not on the outside, No, everything around me stayed the same. It was inside where the shift had settled. A quiet, irreversible tilt of my axis. I didn't see him that day. Or the next. But he was in every space I moved through. Not as a ghost, not as a fantasy. Just a presence I couldn't shake. I stood by the kitchen counter more than once, remembering the exact angle of his glance, the silence that came before the kiss, the softness of it, and how suddenly I had stepped back, not because I regretted it, but because I didn't know what to do next. That uncertainty stayed with me. It followed me through the grocery store, where I stood staring at apples for far too long, not even remembering what I came in for. It echoed in the silence of the house at night, where the sound of the refrigerator hum suddenly felt louder than anything. And it was there when my husband called, his voice crackling through the line, asking how things were, promising to be home by the weekend. I said I was fine. I asked about his meetings. We talked about mundane things, his hotel breakfast, a flight delay, the neighbor's overgrown lawn he noticed on the way out. He didn't sense a change in me. He never did. After that call, I sat on the couch for nearly an hour, staring at nothing. I wasn't trying to make a plan. I wasn't trying to figure out how I felt. I just let myself exist. I think, in some way, I needed that moment to recalibrate. To stop labeling every emotion as right or wrong. To sit with the simple, heavy truth, I didn't feel guilty. Not yet. A few more days passed. Quiet ones. I kept myself busy, but not in the usual sense of avoiding things. I genuinely needed the stillness to settle. I thought maybe he would call. I wasn't sure if I wanted him to. That limbo held me like a breath not yet exhaled. Then, late Thursday afternoon, I opened the front door to find a brown envelope sitting on the step. No name, no note. Inside was the wrench set. The one he had left behind. I smiled, despite myself. There was something so him about it, silent, simple, specific. A tool returned, but not the moment it carried. I didn't text. I didn't call. I just brought it inside and placed it in the drawer where it used to sit, like it belonged. The next morning, he showed up. No knock this time. He waited by the porch until I saw him through the window. I met him outside, heart thudding louder than I expected. He said he had some extra wood slats for the side railing. I didn't ask if we needed them. I just nodded and opened the gate wider. We didn't bring up the kiss. Not directly. But everything we did, every glance, every carefully chosen pause, it all pulsed with what had already been shared. We worked slower than necessary again. Purposefully. I handed him nails. He passed me the hammer. At one point, I stood to stretch, and I caught him looking, not staring, not intruding, but observing. Like he was studying the edges of me he hadn't noticed before. I felt it again. That current. That awareness. But I didn't speak it into existence. Neither did he. That evening, I sat with a pen and a notebook, intending to write something, anything, that could make sense of the mess inside me. But the page stayed mostly blank. I wrote his name once. Then crossed it out. I didn't know what I wanted from him. I didn't know what I was willing to risk. What I did know was that something had woken up in me, something that had been dormant far too long. And now that it stirred, it didn't want to go back to sleep. The next day, it rained. A soft, steady rain that turned the windows gray and made everything smell like wet leaves and pine. I wasn't expecting him. I didn't expect anyone. I curled up with a book I didn't read and a blanket that smelled faintly of our last holiday. I let the hours slide past in a kind of haze. Then, in the late afternoon, a knock at the door broke the rhythm of the rain. I opened it without checking. He was there, water dripping from his jacket, eyes darker than usual from the stormlight. He said he was just out for a drive and saw the rain picking up. I nodded toward the coat rack, silently inviting him in. He stepped inside, the smell of rain clinging to his clothes. He didn't bring tools this time. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table, listening to the rain. No words. Just the occasional clink of a spoon or the creak of wood beneath our chairs. And in that silence, there was no pressure. Just presence. A shared understanding that didn't need definition. After a while, he stood to leave. I walked him to the door. It was there, with his hand on the handle, that he paused. He turned, met my eyes, and for the first time since that kiss, we both stood on the edge of something unspoken. But neither of us moved forward. Not this time. After he left, I watched his taillights disappear down the street. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just stood there, breathing. Something inside me felt calm. It was the strangest feeling. Not certainty, not resolve. Just a soft, settling kind of clarity. I wasn't sure where we were headed. I didn't even know if there was a path forward for us. But for the first time in a long time, I was fully awake in my own life. And that, in itself, felt like the beginning of something. The next few days unfolded with a deceptive kind of normalcy. I woke up, made my bed, opened the windows. I went through the motions, but it was like I was watching myself from a distance, an actress playing a role I used to know by heart. And somewhere beneath it all, I was waiting. Not for a message, not for a visit. For the moment when everything would tilt again. It came quietly. He stopped by late one afternoon with a small container of screws in hand and said he had noticed a loose hinge on the back gate. I hadn't noticed. Or maybe I had and pretended I didn't. I didn't ask if he needed help. I just stepped aside and let him in. I offered tea again. He declined, gently, and walked out to the yard. I stood by the kitchen window and watched him work. His movements were deliberate, steady. There was something calming about it, watching someone fix something that could be fixed. When he was done, he came back inside and wiped his hands on a rag he pulled from his jacket pocket. He looked around the kitchen like he was memorizing it, or maybe avoiding my eyes. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The silence between us had begun to take on its own language. That evening, I sat on the porch with a book in my lap and didn't read a word of it. My fingers traced the edge of the pages absent-mindedly as the sun dipped behind the trees. The air smelled like pine needles and old wood. I felt restless, but not in the way that demanded action. It was a quiet restlessness, the kind that tugged at the back of your mind while everything else looked fine. Later that night, I found myself in the bathroom mirror again. I studied the crease between my brows, the way my eyes curved downward at the corners. I ran my fingers through my hair, pulled it back, let it fall again. I wasn't trying to look younger. I just wanted to see what was left. Who was left? Beneath the roles, the habits, the weight of quiet years. I stared for a long time before turning off the light. The next morning, I went out early to the hardware store. I told myself it was for a replacement bulb, but I wandered aimlessly through the aisles for almost 30 minutes. I didn't need anything. I just needed to be around strangers for a while, faces that didn't know me, eyes that hadn't seen what I'd done. There was a strange kind of comfort in anonymity. In being just another woman holding a basket with nothing in it. When I got home, I noticed the gate was already fixed. The hinge no longer squeaked. It swung smoothly, like it had always been that way. He hadn't said anything. Just did it. I stood there for a few seconds longer than I needed to, one hand resting on the wood, letting my fingers slide across the metal as if it could tell me something I didn't already know. 2 days later, he came by again. No tools this time. Just a folded piece of paper in his hand. A list of sorts, materials for sealing the porch wood before winter. He asked if I wanted to pick them up together or if he should just drop them off later in the week. I told him I didn't mind going with him. He nodded. And that was that. The drive was quiet. We didn't play music. We didn't talk about anything that mattered. But the silence was full again. Not heavy, not uncomfortable. Just charged, like a storm waiting behind the clouds. At the store, we moved through the aisles like we'd done it 100 times before. He handed me a roll of tape, I passed him a brush. At one point, he reached for something on a high shelf, and I stood close behind him, too close. I didn't move. On the way home, he missed the turn. I didn't say anything. We drove in silence for another 10 minutes before he pulled into an overlook above the river. He turned off the engine but didn't open the door. We both stared out at the water below, where the late afternoon light scattered in sharp streaks across the surface. He said my name once. Just once. And I turned to look at him. We didn't move closer. We didn't reach for each other. But the space between us changed. When we got back, he helped me unload the supplies. We didn't linger this time. No small talk. No slow walks to the door. Just a quiet, measured goodbye that hung in the air like a half-finished sentence. That night, the restlessness returned. Stronger now. Like something inside me had started pacing. I wanted to tell someone. Not the details. Just the truth, that I was standing at a line I hadn't known existed until I crossed it. But there was no one to tell. Not really. So I wrote it down. 3 pages. Front and back. Everything I couldn't say out loud. I didn't write names. Just moments. Fragments. Questions I didn't have answers to. When I finished, I folded the pages and put them in a drawer. I don't know why. I didn't plan to show them to anyone. Maybe I just needed to see the truth in ink. Something permanent. The following afternoon, he showed up again. No excuse this time. No tools, no supplies. He just said, I was driving by. I nodded. Invited him in. We sat in the living room this time. No projects between us. No roles to play. He looked around, took in the framed photos, the folded blanket on the chair, the dent in the wall near the stairs where the vacuum always bumped. He said it smelled like cinnamon in the house. I told him I had made muffins that morning. I hadn't. But I smiled anyway. He didn't ask for one. He stayed only 20 minutes. And when he stood to leave, he hesitated. I knew what was coming before it happened. We kissed. No words. Just that. And then he left. I stood at the window after the door closed, arms wrapped around myself. Not for warmth. Just for grounding. The sky was pale and open. The kind of quiet sky that follows a decision no one wants to say out loud. I stayed there until the porch light flickered on automatically. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. But I felt it. The shift. The certainty. Something had begun. And this time, I didn't pretend not to notice. The following morning arrived with the kind of chill that settles deep into the bones, even when the sun is shining. I pulled the curtains open and stood there, arms wrapped around myself, watching the light stretch slowly across the porch where it had all begun. The wood looked different now, warmer, smoother, cared for, but maybe that was just my mind layering new meaning over old structure. Everything I did that morning felt heightened. I noticed the smell of my soap more clearly. The way the floor creaked under the same spot near the fridge. The faint hum of the coffee maker that usually blended into the background. I moved through it all slowly, as if rushing might cause something to break, inside me, around me, I didn't know. He didn't come that day. I didn't expect him to. We had crossed a line, and it hovered over everything now, like a fog that wouldn't lift. But I saw him the next afternoon. I was in the garden, cutting back the hydrangeas that had started to wilt at the edges. The sky was a washed-out blue, the kind that only appears right before autumn finally claims the season. I heard footsteps before I saw him, and I didn't turn immediately. I knew it was him. There was a weight to his presence I had come to recognize, even in silence. He said hello in a voice low and careful, and I straightened up, brushing dirt from my gloves. There was something tentative in his posture, like he wasn't sure if he should be there. I nodded once, not offering a smile, not turning him away. Just acknowledging him the only way I knew how. We stood there for a long time, not speaking. The wind moved through the trees, scattering a few dry leaves along the edge of the porch steps. And then, he said something I wasn't expecting. "I think we should talk." It was simple. Measured. And it landed with a weight I hadn't been prepared to carry yet. I nodded again. No words. I wasn't ready to speak them, not yet. But I led him into the kitchen, the familiar space suddenly unfamiliar with him standing there again, but this time with something between us we couldn't ignore. I poured 2 glasses of water, mostly just to have something to do with my hands. He sat at the table, same seat as before, and waited. Not impatiently. Just, quietly. I leaned against the counter, arms folded. And still, we didn't speak. Then we did. We talked, not about what happened, not directly, but about time. About how quickly years pass without us noticing. About how easy it is to settle into comfort and mistake it for fulfillment. About how sometimes we don't even realize we're lonely until someone sits beside us and listens. I told him I didn't plan for anything. That it wasn't about rebellion or thrill. It wasn't even about wanting something new. It was about something that had been silent in me for so long, it no longer had a name. He didn't interrupt. He let me speak. And then he told me the same. That he didn't come here looking for anything. That he didn't expect me to open the door, or the porch, or anything else. That he wasn't proud of the space we now stood in, but he wasn't running from it either. I think we both knew that talking wouldn't undo what had been done. But it gave it shape. And shape gave it weight. It wasn't a moment anymore. It was a truth we were both carrying. When he stood to leave, I followed him to the door. We kissed. We didn't speak after. We didn't promise anything. We didn't plan. He just left. That night, I found myself writing again. Not in the same journal. Not to document or confess. Just to see the words laid out clearly. I wrote about the quiet. About the absence of guilt, and how it frightened me more than guilt ever could. I wrote about my husband. About his kindness. His consistency. His absence, and the presence he thought he still held. I didn't blame him. I didn't blame myself. I didn't blame anyone. But I wrote until my hand cramped, and still I kept going, because the act of naming things felt necessary. In the days that followed, I began to move differently. Not dramatically. Just more deliberately. I stopped waiting by windows. I didn't check my phone reflexively. I didn't hover over the porch like I expected it to whisper something new. Instead, I began noticing the small details in my own home. The way my husband's shoes always pointed slightly outward when he left them by the door. How the spice jars were always perfectly aligned, even though I never touched them. I saw the imprint of our life in everything, and I felt both comforted and separate from it. I didn't see him again for several days. When he returned, it was unannounced, as usual. But this time, he didn't step inside. He stayed by the gate, one hand resting on the wood, the other holding a paper bag. He said he brought some sealant for the porch. I thanked him. He asked how I'd been. I said fine. And then we stood in silence again. He didn't ask to stay. I didn't invite him. But as he turned to leave, he paused. Looked at me with something in his eyes I couldn't quite name. It wasn't regret. But it wasn't certainty either. I stood there long after he left. Later that evening, I thought about how quiet endings can be. How they don't always come with slamming doors or raised voices. Sometimes they come with slow nods, unfinished conversations, and a kiss you never forget. And still, the story wasn't finished. Not yet. But for now, it was paused. Held gently in the space between what was and what might be. And I wasn't sure which way I wanted it to tip. The days that followed were slow, and for once, I was grateful for their pace. There was a stillness in them, a space that gave me room to think, to breathe without feeling like I had to perform normalcy. I wasn't avoiding anyone, not actively. But I was withdrawing in ways only I would notice, answering messages a little later than usual, choosing not to join a neighbor for morning coffee, walking shorter loops around the block. I wasn't hiding. I was just conserving. Guarding something I couldn't yet name. My husband called one evening. He was cheerful, distracted, asking about the furnace and whether the filter had been changed. I said yes, though I wasn't sure if it had. He talked about a meeting that ran too long and a steakhouse he tried in a different city. I asked polite questions. I laughed in the right places. And when he said, "I miss you," I hesitated only a second before replying, "I miss you too." But the words felt unfamiliar in my mouth. Like a language I hadn't spoken in years. After we hung up, I stood in the hallway with the phone still in my hand, staring at nothing in particular. The house was quiet again, the way it always was after he called. I used to cherish those calls, those small touchpoints of connection while he was away. But lately, they felt like reminders of just how far away we'd drifted, even when we were in the same room. The next morning, I woke to overcast skies and the low rumble of a distant storm. I liked weather like that. It suited my mood, blanketed everything in a softness that didn't require smiling or pretending. I made tea instead of coffee, something soothing, and sat at the table without a book or my phone. Just me, the steam rising, the ticking of the kitchen clock. That's when I saw the text. It wasn't from him. It was from my husband. A photo of the two of us from a trip years ago, windy beach, cold noses, the kind of candid that gets framed later. His message said, "Found this in my files. You remember how cold that day was? You wouldn't stop laughing." I stared at it for a long time. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what I could possibly say. Yes, I remembered the day. The wind had tangled my hair so much I'd threatened to shave it all off. We'd been happy then. Or at least, close enough to happiness that it felt real. Eventually, I typed, "I do." I laughed so hard my ribs hurt the next day. He replied with a heart. It should have warmed me. But instead, I felt like I was watching someone else's memory. Like I was on the outside of my own life, peering in through a window. Later that afternoon, he came back. I didn't hear him pull in, but I saw him through the window, standing near the fence, hands in his pockets, waiting. I didn't make him wait long. I stepped outside, arms crossed more from habit than from cold. He looked like he wanted to say something, but didn't. I didn't either. We walked slowly around the side of the house, checking where the porch sealant had settled after the rain. It was an excuse, but at least it was something. We talked about wood grain, moisture absorption, how long it might last through winter. We both knew it wasn't about the porch. When we finished circling back to the front steps, he paused. Then, as if deciding not to think anymore, he looked at me and said, "I've been trying to stay away. Give you space." I wasn't sure if I should come. I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because there were too many versions of the truth, and I didn't know which one I could live with. "I'm not asking for anything," he added. I keep thinking about it. About you. About that moment." I nodded, slowly, unsure if that was agreement or acknowledgement. Maybe both. We didn't touch. We didn't cross any new lines. But we stood there for a long time, on the same wood we had sealed together, surrounded by a house full of things neither of us could name. After he left, I didn't go inside right away. I sat on the steps, fingers trailing along the railing we had built together. The sky had cleared. The air was cool, almost too cool, but I stayed out there anyway. I needed the cold. I needed the honesty of it. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept circling the same unanswerable questions. Was this a phase? A symptom of something deeper? Was it betrayal if I had never set out to deceive? Could you cheat without physicality if your heart wandered elsewhere? I got out of bed and sat in the kitchen. I read through old messages, years of digital threads between me and my husband. At first, they were warm. Intimate. Playful. Then they became shorter. More logistical. Grocery lists, travel updates, reminders to water the plants. I scrolled until the screen blurred, then shut the phone off entirely. The next morning, I decided to rearrange the guest room. It was something I'd been meaning to do for months: shift the dresser, rotate the mattress, donate the old linens I kept for no reason. But the truth was, I needed to move something. To see something change in front of me. I spent hours in there, folding, dusting, vacuuming places no one looked. I found an old photo album in the closet, wedged between board games and winter blankets. I sat on the floor and flipped through it. Vacations, birthdays, blurry shots of cake and candlelight. Photos of the man I married, younger, looser in the shoulders, always smiling. And there I was, too. Smiling back. I didn't cry. I didn't feel sadness. Just distance. Like looking at someone I used to know. That evening, the house felt quieter than usual. Not just empty, but expectant, like it was holding its breath with me. When my phone buzzed, I reached for it without thinking. It was him. A single message. We spent the night together. I read it twice, though I already knew what it said. Knew it by the way my stomach flipped, by the heat that rose in my chest, by the silence that followed. He didn't mean it literally, and I knew that. He meant the moment we shared, drawn out and unspoken, was no longer something we could ignore. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The words were already between us, echoing through the choices we hadn't yet made. And in that quiet, I finally understood, nothing had to happen for something to change. Sometimes, it just does. Quietly. Irreversibly. It had been over a week since I saw him last, and yet he was everywhere. In the way I poured my coffee too slowly in the morning. In the way I stared at my reflection in the hallway mirror longer than necessary. In the way the breeze moved across the porch steps, brushing past the sealed wood we had worked on together. His presence clung to the corners of my days like light through lace, subtle, but impossible to ignore. My husband returned that Friday evening. He came through the front door with the familiar sound of keys dropping into the dish, suitcase wheels bumping over the threshold, and his voice calling out my name with an ease that had once made me feel safe. I answered with the same practiced warmth I had for years, hugged him longer than usual, perhaps out of guilt, or maybe just out of habit. We ate dinner together. He told me about the delays at the airport, the new colleague who spoke too loudly in meetings, the hotel pillow that was too firm. I nodded in all the right places, smiled when I was supposed to, and even laughed once, though I couldn't have repeated the joke if asked. I felt suspended in a version of my life that no longer fit me, as if I had outgrown the walls and hadn't yet decided what to do about it. That night, I lay beside him in bed, staring at the ceiling. He fell asleep quickly, like he always did. I could hear the steady rhythm of his breath and the occasional soft twitch of a dream he'd never remember. I stayed awake for hours, my mind tracing memories like threads, some frayed, some tangled, all leading nowhere certain. The next morning, he offered to run errands while I stayed home. I accepted. As soon as the door closed behind him, I exhaled in a way I hadn't realized I'd been holding in. The silence wrapped around me like a familiar coat, and I moved through the house freely again. Around noon, I heard the knock. It wasn't loud. Just a single, soft tap, barely more than a suggestion. But I knew it was him. I opened the door, and there he stood, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes scanning mine as if to make sure I was really there. No words. Not at first. He didn't need to explain why he came. And I didn't ask. I stepped aside, and he entered. We didn't go to the porch this time. Or the kitchen. We walked down the hallway, past the framed photos, past the closed doors, until we reached the guest room, the one I had rearranged, the one that now held more space than memory. We stood in the middle of the room, facing each other. No words. And then we spent the night together. There are no other details I can give you. Not because I'm protecting anything, but because the moment wasn't about specifics. It wasn't about touch or silence or breath. It was about choice. A deliberate, irreversible step in a direction I hadn't let myself imagine until that moment. Afterward, we didn't speak. We lay beside each other, not touching, but not apart either. The room was dim, lit only by the fading light slipping between the curtains. I listened to his breathing and found comfort in its steady rhythm, so different from the weight of my own thoughts. Eventually, he sat up. Put on his shoes. Buttoned his shirt without haste. I stayed where I was, watching. Not clinging. Just watching. Before he left the room, he turned back and looked at me. There was something in his expression I couldn't name, something between apology and understanding, like he was acknowledging everything without needing to say a word. And then he was gone. The house felt different afterward. Not emptier. Just quieter. As if it were holding a secret between its walls, something it couldn't quite digest. I stayed in the room a while longer, wrapped in the stillness. I didn't cry. I didn't regret. I just sat there, listening to the faint ticking of a clock on the dresser that I hadn't noticed until then. Later that evening, my husband returned. He brought groceries and takeout. He asked how my day had been. I told him it was uneventful. We sat in the living room and watched television. He rested his hand on my leg at one point, casually, like he had 1,000 times before. I didn't move it. But I felt it differently now. Like a question that no longer had a clear answer. When he went to bed, I stayed behind, sitting in the dark, letting the glow from the television flicker across the walls. I thought about the choices we make, the slow ones, the silent ones, the ones we don't recognize until they've already reshaped us. I didn't know what would come next. But I knew the story had shifted. And I couldn't pretend otherwise anymore. In the days that followed, I moved through my life like someone walking across a frozen lake, carefully, quietly, testing every step. There was no immediate consequence. No confrontation. No sudden shift in the air. But beneath the surface, I could feel the tension, like ice stretched thin under the weight of silence. My husband remained unaware. Or perhaps he sensed something but didn't want to name it. He went about his routines, returning late from meetings, answering emails over dinner, leaving his shoes just slightly askew at the door. I watched him more now, not out of guilt, but out of something closer to curiosity. I watched the way he furrowed his brow when he read the news, the way he stirred his coffee in slow circles, the way he smiled at me across the table with a kind of practiced tenderness that made my chest ache. There were moments, quiet ones, passing ones, when I almost reached for him. When I thought about placing my hand over his, about telling him the truth. Not all of it. Just enough. But the words always stayed lodged in my throat, buried under years of careful, unspoken choices. I told myself I was protecting him. But deep down, I knew I was protecting the version of myself he still believed in. The man who had changed that version, who had uncovered parts of me I hadn't even realized were buried, had not returned since that night. No message. No visit. No sign. And though I told myself that was for the best, that space was what we both needed, I found myself scanning the street when I passed the front window. I listened for footsteps that never came. My heart still reacted to the sound of tires on gravel, to the hollow clink of the mailbox lid, to the creak of the porch board settling under weight that wasn't his. Eventually, I stopped waiting. Instead, I began to clean. Not out of necessity. The house wasn't dirty. But I needed to move, to touch every object, to re-establish ownership of the life I had built. I scrubbed the baseboards, wiped the windows, reorganized drawers that hadn't been touched in years. I found an old watch in the back of the nightstand, its face cracked, battery long dead. I didn't throw it away. I placed it gently in a small box with other things I wasn't ready to part with. On the third morning, I found myself in the laundry room, folding towels with an unusual amount of focus. That's when my phone buzzed. It was a message. Not from him. From my husband. A simple question: did you take care of the insurance renewal? I answered, yes. Done yesterday. He replied with a thumbs up. Then nothing more. I stared at the screen for a long moment. The exchange was so ordinary, so harmless. And yet it gutted me in a way I couldn't quite explain. It reminded me of everything that had faded without either of us noticing. Of how intimacy had slowly been replaced by logistics. How our life together had become a series of shared tasks instead of shared truths. That afternoon, I went out for a walk. I didn't take my phone. I didn't even bring my keys, I left the back door unlocked. I just needed to move, to put distance between myself and the walls that had started to press in on me. I walked without direction, letting my feet choose the route. Past the bakery where we used to buy scones on Sundays. Past the park where I once took photos of the autumn leaves because the colors seemed too vivid to be real. Past the diner where we'd celebrated his promotion, years ago, over 2 salty fries and watery coffee. Everything looked the same. But it wasn't. Nothing was. When I returned, the house was just as I had left it. Still. Silent. I stepped inside, closed the door behind me, and leaned against it, letting my forehead rest against the wood. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to cry. Not because of guilt. Not because of longing. Because of grief. Grief for the version of my life that had slipped through my fingers while I wasn't looking. For the years I had spent not asking questions. For the parts of myself I had buried beneath routine and politeness and sacrifice. That evening, he came back. Not my husband. The man I shouldn't have kissed. Shouldn't have touched. Shouldn't have let into my home, my thoughts, my body. He stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, eyes steady. I opened the door before he knocked. We didn't speak. I stepped aside. He entered. We sat in the kitchen. I poured tea for both of us, though neither of us touched it. The air was heavy with things unsaid. Finally, I broke the silence. I can't keep doing this. He didn't flinch. Didn't argue. He just nodded, slowly. I don't know what I want, I continued, my voice quieter now. But I know this isn't it. Not hiding. Not hurting people who trust me. Still, he said nothing. But I saw it in his eyes, something like agreement. Or maybe sorrow. Or both. He stood. So did I. We didn't kiss. We didn't touch. But we lingered, standing too close, both of us unwilling to move first. Then he left. The door closed behind him with a softness that hurt more than any slammed goodbye ever could. That night, I didn't sit in the dark. I turned on every light in the house. I cooked dinner. I watered the plants. I watched television with the volume too high. I did all the things I had avoided in the days before. I wasn't trying to pretend. I wasn't trying to forget. I was trying to choose. Not between two men. But between two selves. And I wasn't sure yet which one would survive. The day after he left, quietly, without protest or promise, I woke up feeling hollow in a way that surprised me. It wasn't devastation. It wasn't relief. It was something quieter, more fragile. A space inside me that had been filled for a brief moment and was now emptied again, echoing with everything that hadn't been said. I moved slowly through my morning, avoiding mirrors and windows. I didn't want to see my face, or catch a glimpse of the driveway, or be reminded of what had happened in the silence between two people who had stepped too far past a line and then tried to step back. I folded laundry. I swept the kitchen. I made coffee and let it go cold without taking a sip. My husband came home early from work that day. He said his meetings had finished ahead of schedule. He looked tired, but content, the way people look when the rhythm of their life has remained uninterrupted. I greeted him at the door and pressed my lips to his cheek, then stepped back quickly before he could linger. He noticed. I saw it in the way his brow dipped, the way his smile faltered just slightly. But he didn't ask. Maybe he didn't want the answer. Or maybe he already knew there was something between us that had changed. That night, we sat at the dinner table and talked about plans for the holidays. He wanted to invite his father over for a long weekend, maybe even have him stay in the guest room now that it had been rearranged and refreshed. I forced myself to keep chewing, to nod, to offer something that resembled agreement. But my stomach turned as I imagined the three of us in the same house, moving through shared spaces, pretending everything was exactly as it had always been. I excused myself after dinner and took a long shower. The water was too hot, but I didn't adjust the dial. I stood under the stream until my skin flushed pink and my thoughts began to loosen. I imagined what it would feel like to tell the truth. To lay it bare. To let it all crash down and see what remained. But I didn't. When I came back into the bedroom, he was already asleep, one arm slung across the empty side of the bed. I climbed in carefully, trying not to disturb him, though I knew my presence had already done enough. The next morning, I opened the kitchen window and let the cool air in. Autumn had turned, suddenly and fully. The trees outside had gone brittle at the edges, their colors dimming, preparing to fall. There was something deeply familiar in that. something I understood. I stood at the sink for a long time, staring into the yard. The porch was still there, solid and well kept. But the memories layered onto it had begun to rot beneath the surface, like leaves trapped under damp boards. I had thought it was a place of restoration. A place where something new could begin. But now it felt like a monument to a decision I couldn't undo. Around noon, my husband left to meet a friend for lunch. I told him I had errands to run, but I stayed home. I wandered from room to room, touching objects without reason, the lip of a bowl, the edge of a picture frame, the corner of a folded blanket. Everything in the house felt too loud. Too intact. Too false. I sat on the edge of the bed, stared at the carpet, and tried to feel present. But the weight of the past few weeks pressed down on me until I had to lie back and close my eyes. I wasn't tired. Just overwhelmed by the stillness that came after motion. And then it happened. A buzz from my phone. One small sound, but enough to startle me upright. It was a message from him. I didn't open it immediately. I sat there, holding the phone in my hand, heart racing. My thumb hovered over the screen, but something in me resisted. I was afraid of what he'd written. Afraid of what I would feel if I read it. Or worse, what I wouldn't. Eventually, I opened it. It was short. Just a single sentence. I won't come by again. No punctuation. No explanation. I read it 3 times, then locked the phone and placed it face down on the nightstand. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. But I felt something unspool inside me, a thread I had been gripping too tightly, finally released. There was nothing dramatic in the moment. No shattering. No collapse. Just the quiet understanding that something had ended, and this time, it wouldn't be undone. The rest of the day passed in pieces. I cleaned out the pantry. Threw out expired jars. Wiped down shelves. I went through the mail and sorted bills from junk. I cooked dinner and ate half of it. My husband called to say he'd be late. I said, "That's fine," and meant it. After dinner, I sat in the living room with the lights off, only the glow of a small lamp in the corner. I watched shadows stretch across the floor, listened to the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock. My body ached, not from movement, but from restraint. From holding in everything I had been afraid to let out. When he came home, I was still sitting there. He asked how my day was. I said it was fine. He kissed the top of my head, then walked upstairs. And I stayed there, motionless, staring at the space where his footsteps had just been. That night, as I lay beside him in bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought about all the versions of myself I had become in the last few months. The woman who waited. The woman who crossed a line. The woman who said nothing. The woman who chose silence over destruction. I didn't know which version would wake up in the morning. But I knew this one, this version, here in the dark, was almost ready. Almost. The finality of his message sat with me for days. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry or proud, but because I believed him. I believed that he meant it, that he wouldn't come back, that whatever had passed between us had ended at exactly the point it was supposed to. There were no what-ifs left, no lingering maybes. Only silence. In the absence of him, my life rearranged itself. The hours returned to their previous shape, morning routines, the soft shuffle of my husband in and out of rooms, the sound of water boiling, the soft thud of the mailbox lid each afternoon. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I noticed things more now. The way the air shifted before the heat kicked on. The way the light through the curtains fell in gentle stripes across the dining table. The way my hands moved through daily tasks as if guided by something deeper than muscle memory. I was still here, still functioning, still participating in the life I had built. But something beneath the surface had cracked open, and no amount of quiet could patch it shut again. My husband began to ask more questions. Small ones, at first, where I'd been that afternoon, who I had lunch with, why I hadn't answered my phone right away. I answered them all truthfully, but briefly. There was nothing to hide anymore, but everything to protect. Then came the morning that changed everything. He was in the kitchen, making toast, scrolling through his phone, just like every other morning. I was standing by the sink, rinsing a mug, only half listening to the birds outside the window. And then I heard him say my name, not casually, not softly, but in a voice that carried weight. I turned. He held my phone in his hand. His eyes didn't rise to meet mine. He was reading. At first, I didn't understand. My mind scrambled through possibilities. Had I left something open? Had I written something I didn't remember? But then I remembered the thread, the messages. The silence that had spoken louder than any confession could. I didn't mean to, he said quietly, his voice lower now. Your screen lit up, and I saw the name. He didn't say the name. He didn't need to. I stood frozen, water running over my fingers, pooling in the sink. What is this? He asked. The question wasn't accusatory. It was quiet. Afraid. I turned off the faucet, dried my hands on a towel I didn't remember hanging, and walked over to the table. I sat down. And then, I told him. Not everything. But enough. Enough to break his silence. Enough to make his hands tremble slightly as he set the phone down. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand explanations. He simply stared at the wall behind me, his face shifting between disbelief and resignation. How long? He asked. Not long, I answered. It's over. He nodded once, but I knew it wasn't understanding. It was survival. He needed a gesture, something to keep the world from tipping beneath him. The rest of the day passed in fragments. We moved around each other like strangers at a train station, careful not to bump, careful not to speak too much, careful not to crumble. He left in the afternoon, said he needed air, and I didn't ask where he went. When he returned hours later, he looked older. Not visibly, but inwardly, like someone who had stepped through a door and found the room he expected was gone. We didn't talk that night. We didn't sleep much either. But in the morning, he made coffee. 2 mugs. Set mine on the counter the way he always did. I thanked him. He nodded. It was the beginning of a different kind of silence. One not built on avoidance, but on reckoning. Over the following week, we tiptoed through conversations. We didn't speak about the specifics again, but we spoke about us, about the years that had settled between us like dust, about the space that had grown so quietly neither of us had noticed until it was filled by someone else's shadow. He asked me, at one point, if I had been unhappy for a long time. I told him no. That I hadn't been unhappy, just numb. Just distant. Just misplaced inside a life that had gone unchanged for too long. He didn't argue. I asked him if he had felt it too. He said yes. And then we sat in the living room together, not as husband and wife exactly, not as enemies either, but as 2 people facing the same wound from different angles. There were no promises after that. No sweeping decisions. Just a quiet agreement to keep moving forward. We started eating meals at the table again. We began walking together in the evenings. Short walks, slow ones, full of pauses and silence, but together. I didn't expect forgiveness. And I didn't ask for it. I only showed up. Each day. Fully. Without pretending. Eventually, we stopped avoiding the guest room. We left the door open. It became a room again, not a symbol. The sheets were washed. The air refreshed. And the house began to breathe again, softly, cautiously, like something learning how to exist after a long sleep. The final message from him, the man I had once welcomed through that door, remained on my phone, unread again, buried in a thread I no longer opened. I didn't delete it. I didn't need to. Some things don't require closure. Some things are simply meant to pass. As for us, we're still learning. Still stretching toward each other in small ways. Still rebuilding something we once thought didn't need attention. I don't know what the end of this story is. But I know where I am now. Here. Present. Changed. And for now, that's enough.